So I had my first exhibition in 2010, but don't worry, I'm not some highfalutin artist you've never heard of. It was a local village art fair, and it was in something called vanstallation. So that's right, an installation in the back of a van in a car park. So my exhibition was called Knitting World, and it was made up of 3 pieces of work: On the Rocks, which is a beach in a suitcase; Domestic Bliss, which was a living room on a wooden tea tray; and That Sinking Feeling, a man alone in a fish tank surrounded by mirrors and up over his head in water. Don't ask. I've always loved making things, and I'd made these 3 tableaux based on knitting patterns from the 1960s and 70s. But to tell you how I came to make them, I have to go back in time to the 1970s. We lived around the corner from my granny until I was 10, and I used to stay with her at weekends. And Saturday mornings at Granny's were famous for hot pancakes and fresh wheaten bread. The bread would wake me, and I never ever had to be called from my bed to get up. And the heat of the pancake melted the butter and the strawberry jam so that it ran in a really slippery river down my fingers. And I've never tasted anything like it to this day. I don't really remember how I started staying there at weekends, because we only lived round the corner, but I know I was there every weekend from I was no age. I would help her with the housework. I don't think she needed any help at the housework then anyway, but I was allowed to help with dusting the ornaments. But of course I wasn't allowed to dust the big dogs until I was about 11, but I could clean the brass candlesticks and the wee brass bells. I really loved her gorgeous purple carpet sweeper, but I was always annoyed when I bashed it against the door or the edge of the sofa and it would spill its dusty guts onto the clean carpet. You could never get all that dust and fluff lifted again. And Granny kept the sweeper even when she got herself a hoover. For the scullery floor, she said, though I suspect she kept it for me. After the housework, it was my time with her. And growing up in a big family, being at Granny's was my place for peace to read and make things. She always bought me the Bunty comic, and so she had cut out the dolls and the clothes from the back page, and I'd glue the doll onto a cereal packet she had saved for me. But what I remember most clearly is that we made doll's house furniture. We made a bath out of a margarine tub and, yes, sticky back plastic. She was quite the craftswoman, my granny. And we made chairs and a sofa out of the bigger Cook's matchboxes, and we sewed them into bits of material with a special stitch that she taught me called a ladder stitch. But my fondest memory is making a television set out of a small matchbox with a square cut out of one side for the pictures. And then we'd cut the pictures of programmes out of the Radio Times and keep them inside the matchbox for a change of show for the dolls. I can't tell you how much I loved changing the TV programme for those dolls. But I learned so much. I learned how to cut from a pattern and sew felt together to make dolls, teddy bears, a dog, and for some unknown reason, a crab. I made clowns, here I have one, from old pyjamas and pom-poms, tie-dyed my trousers and t-shirts. And up until I was 12, I went to bed every Saturday night after my bath with rags in my hair for my famous ringlets, ready for mass in the morning. I was the local Shirley Temple, and boy was I glad when that rigmarole stopped. I probably stayed with her every weekend until I was about 14, when hockey and the blue light discos at the Scout Hall drew me away. Granny had her first heart attack when I was 17, and I volunteered to go and live with her when she was discharged from hospital. At the time, I was in upper sixth, and my school was about a mile from her house, so I could get to school easily and have peace to revise for my A-levels. She really wasn't well, and her bed was moved into the living room. I'd get up at 6 to light the fire and warm the room for her to get up. Then I'd get myself ready for school in the freezing bathroom before making porridge while she got washed and dressed. Then both of us dressed, we'd eat the porridge and drink the tea. I'd run home in my lunch break to see to the fire, get her lunch and make sure she was okay. And then I'd run back in time for whatever lesson I had. I had such great teachers, and I was never told off if I was a bit late. I was only supposed to stay for a few months until she was back on her feet, but I stayed on living with her on and off until I was about 20. Soon enough, she was looking after me, cooking, making bread and scones, hot chocolate on winter nights, pancakes for my friends who came over to revise, and a warm welcome for a lovely boyfriend who, even though she was worried sick and prayed for me, every time I went out on his motorbike, she always made him very welcome. So I wonder where he is now. Anyway, eventually after a few false starts, I left for university in Leeds. I went home every holiday, but it was hard seeing how old and frail she was getting. To get a cheap flight in those days, you had to phone Capital Airlines at 6 a.m. on the day before you wanted to fly. We didn't have a phone box in our student house, so I had to get up before 6 and stand in the bitter cold in the phone box. If I managed to get a flight, I'd ring Granny and tell her I'd see her tomorrow, and then she'd tell everyone else. In my second year, I tried for 5 days in a row to get a flight home for Christmas. When I finally landed, she was sitting in the armchair by the window looking out for me. When I saw her, I just knelt down in front of her and took her hands in mine. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "I'm so glad you're home." She was a bad colour and went into hospital 2 days later, where she only stayed for a week. The night she died, I slept in her bed and I cried and cried. But fast forward to 20 years later, and I still couldn't say her name without crying. And I thought to myself, pull yourself together, woman, get a grip. At that time, I just happened to be doing a photography course with a woman who was technically brilliant, but was really much more interested in storytelling through photography. And I could see that maybe this was a way that I could express something about losing my granny. And I booked some one-to-one time with her, and she helped me to make some photograms of items that connected me to her. So that's when you put some objects on some photograph paper and develop it. So you get a very stark black image and white outlines. And while I was doing this, I was also gathering up her letters and old photos. And I happened to say in passing one day to a friend of mine who was a puppet maker and theatre maker, that what I really needed to do to honour my granny was make a doll's house. But what did a 43-year-old want with a doll's house? But of course, my lovely friend Liz heard this in the way that only she can, and she encouraged me to do it and agreed to help me make whatever comes out. So it turns out I worked on it for 6 months, and I made an artwork called Knitting World. So remember that van installation? Well, after all the glory of the day, the chatter in the cafes, the newspaper, photographs, an invite from the council to display it in the library over Christmas, and collecting other people's knitting stories in a lovely little notebook, I drove Mick's van back to the workshop. As I turned off the main road, onto the lane, down to the mill, I pulled over. I knew what I needed, and I just let go of all the sadness I'd been holding on to for so long. Hot tears and howling, and as Granny would have said, the snotters were tripping me. I felt as if everything I'd ever made was in the back of the van. And here I was, calling out her name, thanking her for everything she had taught me, and telling her how much I love her, my dear beloved Granny Toner.
Oh, Jacqueline, thank you so much. That's just amazing. It's so full of just love, such
Oh,
massive amounts of love. Your granny sounds like an absolutely wonderful human being.
oh, she was the best woman. She really was. She was kind and generous and skillful, and she just always saw the good in everybody. It was very hard to ever make her complain about anybody at all. It was dreadful growing up such a bad-tempered girl as I was. So,
Where are you joining us from, Jacqueline?
Huddersfield in West
Oh,
Yorkshire.
brilliant. Oh, and how did you come by 10 by 9?
my friend Louise, who was on here tonight, she told me about it, and I used to listen to the podcast.
Right.
And then, of course, I never was able to come over whenever you were live. And then as soon as you were online, it's one of my lockdown wins.
Fantastic.
Being able to come.
Well, it's been a win for us, and
Oh,
I just want to show everyone, you sent through a few photographs today. Padraig's very fond of knitting patterns himself, so this is some of your work, which is brilliant. I think it's inspired. You want to tell us very quickly about that one?
Yeah, that's called On the Rocks. It's behind me, actually. I keep it in my office. So it's a knitting pattern. My mum knit those jumpers. My mum's she was a really expert knitter, and she was ill at the time as well. I should have said that, and she needed a project because she had major surgery and couldn't move. So I gave her adult patterns and made her knit jumpers for dolls. If you know anything about knitting, that's a very complex mathematical procedure, but she was up for it and she did a brilliant job. Look at the work, look at the cable work on this shot. It's amazing. Thank you for the zoom.
That's Now I just have to say, Padraig is doing that, and he is a keen knitter. He took it up during the lockdown, and the house is coming down with hats and gloves and whatnot. So he's become very good. Padraig, can we see the next one, please?
Wow, I've got this one.
Done the two. So this is another one, Jacqueline.
Yes, Domestic Bliss. That one's called Domestic Bliss. So the pattern, the pattern doesn't show, but he's sitting there with his arm on a fluffy cushion. So I made one fluffy cushion, and then I turned a Barbie doll into a tea tray, so he could rest his elbow on her head. And she's topless, holding a tray with a bottle of Guinness on it. And then her legs are a lamp. Louise says that's my fave. So that's her lamp. So we did have a little bulb in that so that she could shine a light on his newspaper.
Very good.
And then I made, I used to make hats, like proper, like people-sized hats. So I had the best fun making a little miniature. Is it past the 9 o'clock watershed? Yes, it is. I know. What would Granny say about this? Honestly, she'd be horrified about the nakedness. She'd be mortified.
You'd be surprised how
maybe after Gida's story, actually, maybe Granny's know more than you think.
Jacqueline, we're so delighted. Thank you so much.